Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organisation of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, The organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness that shortens life, and the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete, because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns, when the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness, where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission, and the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages, and the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into. And the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples. And the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation, and the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honours the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future. And this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events. And when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time, no different than up and down. And this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure, even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now. But the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves, but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence. And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning, rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone, exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really it is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous, because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time, if the time itself is constructed, and the person at each moment is different, and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged, only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow. And this narrative is not true or false, but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time, the abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness, its texture, is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes. Because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted, and what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality, the question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history, and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative. And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli. And what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred, is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers. And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story? What makes sense in retrospect? And retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness. And so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred. And the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain, backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality, because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence. And these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises. And this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence, because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable. And most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version. And this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces. And the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be. And life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary. And perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then. but the saying is happening now is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now that interprets itself as being about later, but the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct, only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes, and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives? To consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function. And seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom, not freedom from time but freedom within it, freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously, and what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently, and the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration, and only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives. And the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing, but is really just being, just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition an emotional resonance, and once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms, and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified. Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted. And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true, but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them, and the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role, because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Are weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias, and the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose, and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth, without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, and tribes do not care about truth except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built, and challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, Because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering. Is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see? And the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing as illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly. When the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference, and the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective, but belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, what prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty. And uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape. And the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true. And truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced, because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided. And these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given, and the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable, and the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible, and the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered, and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe, is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing, and collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger. And so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world. And navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from. Never what afflicts us, because we see clearly we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintains through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception, but the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth. And the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right. And the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside. From the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity, by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately, that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time. And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness, in the living voice, in the moment of speaking where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false, that what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible. And recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present, but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system. And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning. And difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference. As we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be. And the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time. to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already is a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary but reveals the structure of what it supplements, reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie-writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, is writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend. can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate but that are nonetheless there in the text, and this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace, and the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down, and interpretation is therefore infinite, not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations, not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin, and this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient, and recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference, and this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive contexts and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. There are no moral rules, no principles that hold across all situations, no universal guidelines that can be written down and followed like instructions for assembling furniture. And this is not because morality is arbitrary or because ethics collapses into relativism, but because the moral quality of an action depends entirely on context, on the particular features of the particular situation, on the way reasons interact and combine and transform each other in ways that resist codification, resist generalization, resist the kind of systematic thinking that philosophy has pursued for thousands of years. Jonathan Dancy calls this moral particularism, the view that ethical judgment does not require principles, that one can be a perfectly competent moral agent without believing in rules, without consulting maxims, without checking whether an action conforms to some universal law. Because morality emerges from the details, from the specific configuration of factors that make this situation different from every other situation, and what is right here may be wrong there. Not because the rule changed, but because there was never a rule to begin with, only the illusion of one, only the human tendency to see patterns where there is only particularity, only the desperate need for certainty in a domain that offers none. Aristotle glimpsed this. He said that ethics was not like mathematics, that it dealt with things that held, for the most part, that moral judgment required phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what matters in a situation and respond appropriately. And this could not be reduced to rule following, could not be taught through principles alone, because wisdom was about seeing, about recognizing the morally salient features, about knowing which factors counted and which did not. And this knowledge came from experience, from immersion in the messy particularity of human life, from confronting situations that resisted easy categorization, that demanded attention to what was actually there, rather than what the theory said should be there. Kant tried to eliminate this messiness. He wanted ethics to be like geometry, certain and universal and necessary, and he argued that moral worth came only from acting according to principle, from following the categorical imperative, from treating humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And this sounded rigorous. It sounded like progress, like philosophy finally getting serious about ethics. But Dancy argues that Kant's entire project was misconceived, that the search for moral principles was a mistake from the start, that principles do not capture what matters morally. They obscure it. They force attention away from the particular situation and toward abstract rules that may not apply, that may distort judgment rather than guide it. Consider lying. Kant said lying was always wrong, always a violation of duty, always impermissible regardless of consequences. And this seems clear, seems like the kind of principle ethics needs. But Dancy asks us to imagine cases. A murderer comes to the door and asks where your friend is hiding. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow the principle, even when it leads to horror? And Kant, remarkably, said yes, said that lying was wrong, even here, even when truth enables murder. And this is where the principle reveals its inadequacy, its blindness to context, its inability to track what actually matters in the situation, which is not the abstract wrongness of lying, but the concrete reality of a life in danger, of a choice between honesty and complicity in violence. Mill tried to fix this with consequentialism, with the principle of utility, the idea that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote suffering. And this seems more flexible, more sensitive to outcomes, more attuned to what actually matters. But Dance argues that consequentialism is just another form of generalism, another attempt to reduce morality to a principle. And the principle fails in the same way. It forces all situations through a single lens. It demands that everything be translated into units of pleasure and pain. It ignores the particular features that make one situation different from another, the commitments and relationships and histories that shape what is owed to whom, that make some considerations relevant and others not. And no principle can capture this. No rule can account for the holism of reasons, the way moral factors interact in ways that are not additive, not combinable according to fixed formulas, but emergent, context-dependent, irreducibly particular. The holism of reasons is Dante's central insight, the idea that a feature that counts in favour of an action in one context might count against it in another, or might be morally neutral in a third. And this is not because the principle changed, but because there is no principle, only the way reasons function in concrete situations. Consider pleasure. It seems like a good-making feature, something that counts in favour of an action. But the pleasure taken in another's suffering is not good, it is contemptible. It transforms what might have been a reason into something else entirely. And this transformation is not rule-governed. It emerges from the particular configuration of features, from the relationship between pleasure and cruelty, between satisfaction and harm. And no principle can predict this in advance. No rule can tell you when pleasure counts positively and when it does not, because the answer depends on details that resist formalization, that require attention to the specific case, to the particular way elements combine and interact and generate moral significance. Ross saw this problem and tried to solve it with prima facie duties, with the idea that principles hold other things being equal, that there are multiple duties that can conflict, and when they conflict one must judge which is weightier in the particular situation. And this seems like a compromise between generalism and particularism, a way to preserve principles while acknowledging context. But Dance argues that prima facie duties do not solve the problem, they only relocate it, because the judgment of which duty is weightier is itself particularist. It requires attention to the specific features of the situation. It requires exactly the kind of moral perception that particularism emphasizes. And if that perception is doing all the work, if the real moral judgment happens when deciding between competing duties, then the principles are not guiding action. They are just labels for types of considerations, and the substantive work is being done by particularist judgment, by the ability to see what matters here and now, not by consulting rules, but by attending to reality. Hare tried to rescue generalism with supervenience, with the idea that if two situations are identical in their natural properties, they must be identical in their moral properties, that moral facts supervene on natural facts. And this seems right. It seems like a minimal constraint on moral judgment, that one cannot say this action is right, and that action is wrong if they are exactly the same in every non-moral respect. But Dance accepts supervenience while denying that it entails generalism, because supervenience is just the claim that morality is not arbitrary, that it tracks features of situations, but it does not follow that those features function according to principles, that they behave the same way in every context, that they can be codified into rules. And this is the crucial distinction between the idea that morality is reason responsive, that it answers to facts about situations, and the idea that it is principle based, that it can be systematized into universal laws. And Dance argues that the first is true and the second is false, that ethics is responsive to reasons without being governed by principles, that judgment can be rational without being rule-following, that one can give explanations for moral claims without appealing to generalizations. This seems strange. It seems like judgment without principles must be arbitrary, must be mere intuition, mere feeling, mere subjective response. And this is the standard objection to particularism, the charge that it collapses into relativism or emotivism or some form of irrationalism. But Dance insists that particularist judgment is rational, that it can be defended, can be explained, can be argued for. But the defense does not take the form of deriving the judgment from a principle. It takes the form of pointing to features of the situation, of saying, look at this, see how it matters, see how it combines with that to generate this moral requirement. And this is not irrational. It is not arbitrary. It is simply a different form of rationality, one that operates at the level of the particular rather than the universal, one that trusts perception rather than deduction, one that recognizes that moral reality is too complex, too context-dependent, too holistic to be captured in rules. Wittgenstein would have recognized this. His discussions of rule following showed that rules do not apply themselves, that every application of a rule requires interpretation, requires judgment about whether this case falls under the rule, and that judgment cannot itself be rule-governed on pain of infinite regress. And this means that, at some point, judgment must be direct, must be a matter of seeing how to go on, of recognizing the similarity or difference without consulting a further rule. And if this is true for linguistic rules, it is even more true for moral rules, where the situations are more complex, the factors more numerous, the interactions more unpredictable, and the idea that one could capture all of this in a set of principles seems not just difficult, but incoherent, seems to misunderstand what morality is, how it functions, what it demands of moral agents. McDowell follows this line. He argues that moral knowledge is perceptual, that the virtuous person sees what is required, sees the morally salient features the way one might see that a painting is balanced or that a joke is cruel. And this seeing is not mediated by principles, it is direct responsiveness to features of the situation. And someone who lacks this responsiveness, who cannot see what matters, cannot be helped by being given rules. Because the problem is not that they do not know the rules, but that they do not see what the rules are supposed to be about. They lack the sensibility that makes moral judgment possible. And this sensibility is developed through experience, through habituation, through becoming the kind of person who attends to certain features and responds to them appropriately. And this is not a matter of internalizing principles, but of refining perception, of learning to see what matters and why it matters and how it matters in this particular case. But if morality does not require principles, if particularism is true, then what happens to moral education, to the teaching of ethics, to the possibility of moral progress and moral reform? Because it seems like without principles, there is no way to criticize existing practices, no standpoint from which to say that this is wrong, no foundation for moral argument. And Dance's response is that criticism does not require principles, that one can point to features of a situation and show that they matter, that they generate reasons, that current practice fails to recognize them. And this is how moral progress happens, not through the discovery of new principles, but through the expansion of moral perception, through learning to see what was always there but previously ignored, like the suffering of animals, like the dignity of marginalized groups, like the long-term consequences of environmental destruction. And these insights are not derived from principles, but from attention to particulars, from refusing to look away, from recognizing that features previously dismissed as irrelevant are in fact morally significant. And this recognition does not require a theory, it requires only the willingness to look, to attend, to respond. Murdoch understood this deeply. She argued that morality was about attention, about the quality of consciousness one brings to situations, about whether one sees clearly or through the distorting lens of selfishness, fear, resentment, pride. And the moral task was not to follow rules, but to purify vision, to remove the obstacles that prevent one from seeing reality as it is. And this was a lifetime's work, a continuous effort of reorientation, of turning away from fantasy and toward truth. And principles could not do this work. They could not force vision. They could not compel attention. They were at best crude summaries of what attentive people had noticed, and at worst they were substitutes for attention, shortcuts that allowed people to think they were being moral without actually looking at what was in front of them, without confronting the particular human being, the particular situation, the particular constellation of factors that demanded response. Levinas took this even further. He argued that ethics began not with principles, but with the face of the other, with the encounter that precedes all theory, all system, all generalization, and the face makes a demand, a wordless claim that cannot be ignored, cannot be systematized, cannot be reduced to rules, and responsibility emerges in that encounter, not from duty, not from utility, not from virtue, but from the sheer fact of the other's vulnerability, the other's dependence, the other's irreplaceable singularity. And every attempt to capture this in principles misses what matters, abstracts away the particular person standing before you, replaces the face with a category, replaces the singular with the general. And this is not ethical thinking, but it's evasion, not responsibility, but the flight from responsibility into the comfort of rules that tell you what to do. So you do not have to look, do not have to see, do not have to respond to what is actually there. Yet the pull toward principles persists, the need to generalize, to systematize, to find order in the chaos of moral life. And this need is not irrational. It reflects something deep in human cognition, the tendency to abstract, to categorize, to find patterns, and in many domains this serves us well. Science progresses through generalization, through finding laws that apply across cases, through ignoring particularity in favor of universality. But Dancy argues that ethics is not like science, that moral properties do not behave like natural properties, that the search for moral laws is misguided not because we have not found them yet, but because they do not exist, because the moral domain is constitutively particular, irreducibly context-dependent, resistant to the kind of systematization that works elsewhere. This does not mean ethics is subjective, does not mean moral judgments are arbitrary, does not mean anything goes. It means only that moral truth is complex, that it emerges from the interplay of factors in particular situations, that it requires attention and judgment rather than calculation and rule following. And the person who wants certainty, who wants an algorithm for ethics, who wants to know in advance what the right answer is asking for something ethics cannot provide. Not because ethics is deficient, but because that is not what ethics is, not what it has ever been, not what it could be without ceasing to be about the messy, complicated, particular reality of human life. The implications of this extend into every corner of moral philosophy, into debates about action and character, about consequentialism and deontology, about the nature of reasons and the structure of normativity. Because if particularism is true, then the entire framework of traditional ethics must be reconsidered, the search for supreme principles abandoned, the hope for moral certainty relinquished, the dream of ethics as a deductive science dissolved, and what replaces it is something humbler, something more difficult, something that requires not cleverness but wisdom, not logic but perception, not theory but attention to the infinite complexity of actual situations. And this is harder, requires more from moral agents, demands that they develop sensitivity rather than memorize rules, that they cultivate character rather than learn formulas, that they become the kind of people who can see what matters rather than the kind who can apply principles. And this cannot be taught in classrooms, cannot be reduced to curriculum, cannot be tested with examinations. It requires living, requires experience, requires the slow accumulation of cases and responses and reflections that gradually shape perception, that refine judgment, that make one capable of navigating moral reality without the crutch of principles. Consider promising. It seems like a clear case for principles. You ought to keep your promises. Seems as close to a moral rule as anything gets. And yet even here context intrudes. A promise made under duress does not bind. A promise to do something immoral should be broken. A promise that circumstances have rendered impossible does not generate obligation. And the more one examines promising, the more exceptions appear. The more qualifications are needed. And at some point the principle becomes so hedged with caveats that it ceases to be a principle at all. It becomes merely a placeholder, a reminder that promises generally matter. But the real work is done by judgment, by the ability to see which features of this particular promise are morally relevant, whether it was freely given, whether circumstances have changed, whether keeping it would cause harm, whether breaking it would violate trust. And these considerations do not combine according to a formula. They do not add up mechanically. They interact holistically, each modifying the significance of the others. And the person who simply applies a rule about promise keeping without attending to these particulars is not being moral. They're being obtuse. They are substituting mechanical rule following for genuine ethical response. The same pattern appears everywhere, in questions of truth-telling and confidentiality, of loyalty and fairness, of care and justice. Every apparent principle dissolves under scrutiny into a complex web of context, dependent considerations, and the moral agent must navigate this web without a map, must see what matters without consulting a guidebook, must respond to reality as it is rather than as theories say it should be. And this is difficult. This is uncertain. This leaves room for disagreement and error, but it is also more honest, more true to actual moral experience, more respectful of the complexity of human life than any theory that tries to reduce ethics to a set of rules that can be mechanically applied. Nietzsche saw the damage that moral principles could do, the way they flattened life, reduced rich particular situations to instances of abstract categories, forced living, breathing human interactions into rigid molds. And he attacked what he called slave morality, the morality of rules and duties and universal principles. Not because he thought ethics was impossible, but because he thought this kind of ethics was life-denying. It served the weak at the expense of the strong. It suppressed excellence in favor of equality. It demanded conformity rather than creativity. And true morality, Nietzsche thought, would be particular, would be about the individual creating their own values in response to their own situation, about saying yes to life in all its particularity rather than subjecting it to the tyranny of universal laws. And while Dancy would not follow Nietzsche all the way into this radical individualism, there is something shared here, a recognition that principles can be oppressive, that they can prevent genuine moral response, that attention to particulars is not a failure of ethics but its essence. Yet there remains the worry about disagreement, because if morality is not governed by principles, then what happens when people disagree? How can disputes be resolved? What court of appeal exists? And the generalist thinks principles solve this? That if both parties accept the same principles, they can reason their way to agreement. But this assumes that moral disagreement is always about the application of shared principles, and often it is not. Often people disagree about what matters, about which features are salient, about how considerations combine, and in these cases principles do not help. They just disguise the disagreement, make it look like a technical dispute about application, when really it is a substantive dispute about perception. And the particularist accepts this, accepts that some disagreements cannot be resolved by argument, that they reflect different ways of seeing, different sensibilities, different forms of attention. And this is not relativism, because it does not deny that one view might be right and the other wrong. It just denies that the rightness can always be demonstrated through principles, that it can always be made compelling to someone who does not already see what matters. And this means that moral education is not about teaching principles, but about training perception, about learning to see what the virtuous person sees. And this is slow, difficult, uncertain work, but it is the only work that matters, the only work that produces genuine moral agents, rather than rule followers who think ethics is about checking boxes and following procedures. The legal system provides a useful contrast, because law requires principles, requires rules that can be codified and applied consistently, requires the ability to determine guilt and innocence through procedures rather than perception. And this is appropriate for law because law serves different purposes. It needs predictability, needs equality before the rules, needs the ability to hold people accountable in ways that do not depend on individual judgment. But morality is not law. Moral judgment is not legal judgment. And the attempt to make morality like law, to replace wisdom with rules, to substitute codification for perception, is a category mistake. It imports into ethics standards that belong elsewhere, that serve different purposes, that distort what morality is actually about, which is responding appropriately to particular situations rather than applying general rules, which is seeing what matters rather than calculating what is required, which is being a certain kind of person rather than following a certain kind of procedure,